Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Hanson, live with Dr. Sonja Lyubomirsky, who is a professor of psychology at the University of California, Riverside, and in my world, a legendary, highly respected authority on the science of happiness and related subjects such as uh, connection and maintaining well-being amidst life's challenges. So it's really great to be here with you. Dr. Lyubomirsky is, I'm going to call her Sonja from now on. Sonja's kind of maybe best known book is called The How of Happiness, a follow-on book, The Myths of Happiness. These are all absolutely top-tier books. They are benchmarks, really, for how to do it right, how to write for a general audience while being grounded in research in ways that are really helpful with approaches that are full of heart and have stood the test of time. And I mean what I'm saying here. So Sonja, thank you for doing this with me.
Thank you so much, Rick. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so just to kind of ground it, as we were chatting just before we began, you're a full-time academic, you're a professor, you're really engaged with that. And also you're living with your at home mainly, sheltering in place as it were, including with 4 kids. I'm seeing some pictures over your shoulder, maybe some of that background. And just kind of how are you doing these days? For starters, how's it going for you?
Yeah, well, better than expected. When it first started, we all have our pandemic stories. I mean, I was really in shock, and I'm very worried and still worried about the economy. But I'm an extrovert, and I also I love going to the office and seeing my colleagues and my graduate students, my students that I work with. And I do a lot of my work actually at a coffee shop, at a Pete's Coffee in Santa Monica. And that was really hard for me not to do that anymore. But, it's amazing how quickly we adapt. There's a phenomenon that I've written about actually in my book, The Myths of Happiness, called hedonic adaptation. Yeah. And basically human beings are remarkably good at adapting to change. So I've adapted to change pretty well. But my kids, I have a 7-year-old, a 9-year-old, and then an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old. And the little ones, they're not in school. They have these great teachers that they're only able to see on Zoom. They just had their last day of classes yesterday. And then the big kids, we're having, I think, like the time of their life in college. And they both go to small liberal arts colleges, which is like the kind of place where you really need to be there to get the benefit of it. Yeah. And they, of course, had to come home. My oldest, the 21-year-old, was doing a study abroad in Paris, of all places, during the whole thing, and had to cut it in half and fly back. So yeah, so it's been, up and down. It's a roller coaster. Right?
Are you more stressed today than was your baseline in January, say, or at this time of year, given the academic calendar and all that? We were talking before about just some of your research recently showing the ways in which many people, notwithstanding all the outer changes, their inner level of well-being has had a certain stability.
Right.
Which is counterintuitive.
Right. So here's the thing, there's so much variability, right? And so I actually have been more stressed. It is really hard to transfer my work all online. Also, I love travel. So not having, like, some people are like, great, I don't have to travel anymore. And I really miss it. And also just being at home all day. My husband working a few feet away from me all day, every day is, I mean, I'm kind of like it now, but it's also rough a little bit. He curses a lot at his computer, so it's a little distracting, but, hopefully he won't do that during this conversation.
So he's over your shoulder right now, actually.
Yeah, well, there's a door between us, but it's very it's not soundproof. But one reason actually I've been stressed is because there's so much going on. And for example, I have my students and I have been engaged in doing this new research comparing how connected and how happy people were feeling right before the pandemic struck in the US, which is we collected data in January, February, and then in April. And so actually getting that off the ground was pretty stressful. But what we found was we have 2 different studies, one with undergraduates in Canada and one with just working adults in the US and UK primarily. We found that actually almost very little change in connection, no change in well-being at all on average. We actually found improvements in loneliness. So in the data set of just sort of working adults, people on average said that reported feeling less lonely, perhaps because they were kind of bonding over the situation, or maybe spending more time with their families, spending more time on Zoom, with people that you normally, do happy hours with. Now, having said that, there's clearly a fraction of people who are really suffering, because they've lost their jobs or because they've fallen ill. And so we have to keep that in mind. But sort of on average, we're finding like less decline, like sort of less change than we expected.
It's interesting from a policy standpoint, the fears that some have had that so-called quarantining or being locked down, all of which has a certain charge on it, just maybe describing a little differently those sheltering in place, there were concerns that would lead to a sort of a massive decrement, a massive decrease in mental health globally, and increase of all kinds of other issues. But you're saying that some of this research is finding that's actually not the case. There's no marked average decline in mental health. And in fact, there's kind of a remarkable stability, if not even an uptick in certain regards.
Right. There's some caveats.
Obviously, we're generalizing, but that's
right.
Really
there's some caveats.
Global finding about the population.
Right. There's some caveats, and the more data need to become available to see, because the data are just coming out. But I've looked at 4 different data sets recently that are showing pretty much no change. But there's like with mental health, there's a fraction of people that are really being triggered, and there's and we also may see delayed reactions with substance. I've actually there's some substance abuse that's increased, and some depression, anxiety. Exactly, domestic abuse. So with the caveats that for a fraction of people, the things are really, really bad. But sort of on average, if you're kind of already doing fairly well and you're reasonably mentally healthy, you may be doing better than average. And I've talked to quite a few friends who've said, it's like, I feel guilty saying this, but I'm happier than I've ever been. I have friends who are home with their adult kids, college age or adult kids, and they're like, we love this. We're now spending all this quality time with our kids that we didn't before. So some people are really enjoying it. Having said that, there's lots of job loss. Like even the people who are saying that they're having the time of their life, some of them are not working, but they're kind of optimistic they'll get their jobs back. So anyway, there's a lot of variability too.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key points. It's funny, I remember this famous kind of story back in the early 1970s about a major handbook in psychology that was the summary of everything that was known about human beings. And then inside that handbook, one of these 600-page fine print type books, there was a 60-page summary of the summary in the back. And then there were 3 statements that were the summary of the summary of the summary that's known about people. And the statements were, some do and some don't. The similarities are greater than the differences, and it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, right. I like that.
I just think that,
it's always nuanced. It depends, right? It's the most common answer that scientists like to give to journalist questions. It depends.
Yeah. So speaking of depending, let's say people who are grappling at this time with challenges to themselves. Maybe they feel more isolated by far than they really want to be. Let's say, so they're dealing with anxieties of different kinds, very real ones. What are some of the things that you've found in your research and in your own maybe personal life that people can draw upon, let's say, to deal with challenges such as social isolation or anxiety?
Well, I guess the guidelines that I would rely on are really not that different today than they would be for any kind of stress or adversity, right? The sort of the things that we know that help people cope with, whether it's with illness or with bereavement or job loss or just sort of stress, relationship breakups, job problems are going to be the same. I mean, I think that relationships really, really matter and are sort of the heart of happiness. I think connecting with others is what makes life have meaning. And so that's my always sort of go-to advice, is that anything you can do to connect with other people is going to help you get through this time. And then we're seeing that happen. People are spending more time, quality time with family members or on Zoom. So I think that's one of the key ones. And I also do a lot of research on gratitude and kindness, sort of on the ways that being grateful for what we have, focusing on what we have as opposed to sort of what we don't have, and then helping and supporting and helping others, which we also see happening a lot these days. People are helping their neighbors, they're supporting their kids' teachers. And that also is not, doesn't just make other people happy, but it makes you happy as well. So those are kind of like different categories of ways that people, what people can do to help them get through this time.
What have you found about people working with their imagination? Because let's say objectively, it's harder to connect. They can't touch. Our son moved out of our home to have a real life, a couple months ago, and it just killed me. It still does that. It's going to be months probably before I hug him again, just because we're thoughtful and careful and want to enable him to be free in his own life. So let's say for people who lack touch or they are disrupted, they're not going to work, those relationships are kind of blown up, let's say. What can they do in their imagination? To what extent is imagined connectivity or, calling up the feeling of being loved or being loving helpful as a resource for people at this time?
Yeah. Well, it certainly can help. And you can think of like something like loving kindness meditation, which is basically imagining love. I think is very helpful for people who are, it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
But I also think, well, you know what? I'll tell you one piece of data that we just got, which is hot off the presses, where it's not published yet, is that we looked at how people are coping from pre to sort of during COVID, and what sort of aspects of sort of your household or your kind of demographics matter. Like, does gender matter? Does age matter? Does living alone versus living with others matter? It turns out that we found that nothing matters. Nothing makes a difference. So people, whether you're young or old, or even people who live alone, we found aren't suffering anymore. Now, there's obviously people who have chosen to live alone may have certain resources that they are relying on. But there's one thing that really mattered, and that is living with a partner, a romantic partner, whether it's a girlfriend or wife or some kind of romantic partner. So it doesn't matter the size of your household, whether you're alone, whether we're living with one person or with 7 people, just one of them is a partner. So the people with partners are doing better. And some of them are actually increasing in connection. Now, we hear a lot of stories in the media about how hard it is to lock down with your spouse and all the tension that's causing, and that is certainly happening too. But on average, people actually are doing better. So that made me think that when you think of policy guidelines, say in the future, and I think many of us know that every pandemic in history has had a second wave. So there's a second wave.
We have a lot of history with plagues.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a good old-fashioned word. I think it reminds me of the Old Testament, if
That's
you will.
True.
Just the plague.
Exactly. Why is it such an old word? Because it's been going around, happening for forever. But anyway, if there's a second wave, I would create a new policy, which is that you can choose a person in your life to quarantine, even if you live alone, or a partner that if you and your partner don't live together, to be able to hug that person and to be with that person, because it just seems like that is really important for well-being, and that's important for physical health. So we're actually finding that people are, their immune systems are stronger when they're connecting with others, or when they're helping others, supporting others.
Yeah, recently I did a post about all this, which had to do with 3 major ways to cope with this time. 1, find your footing. 2, calm and center. 3, tend and befriend. And that phrase will be familiar to you from the work of Shelley Taylor at UCLA. Yeah, different ways of handling stress. And that movement to help is really profound in us. And what I think about it myself a bit is that we have a fundamental freedom in regard to it, a fundamental irreplaceable agency that we have about that, because we may not be able to receive caring, but we can always express caring, if only in our imagination, if only in, as you said, just kind of sending love out to everybody, or just wishing people well, or opening our hearts, frankly. I think a lot of us are grappling with the importance, certainly of opening our hearts to be uncomfortable, if not more, at the while being in touch with the suffering of others these days. I wonder if you could speak more about just your own experience or research about this possibility, even if you can't touch someone, even if you don't have a mate. In other words, even if you're dealing with the crud that so many people are really dealing with, the objective limitations of their life. Still, we have this capacity inside ourselves to evoke experiences. And once those neurons are firing in that way, as it were, we're having that experience. It's live inside our own, the inner theater, if you will.
Right,
and
right.
we
Like
have a chance to internalize the experience of it. So what do you
right, right. Yeah, like watching a movie, you experience the emotions. No, absolutely. I mean, I don't know, maybe because I don't know, am I biased towards like actual connection? So,
Oh, I'm all for it. But what if you
yeah.
don't have, you
Well,
can't?
no, you mean like if you, I mean, but you can write a letter, right? You
Okay.
can write a letter, you can get on the phone, you can
Mhm.
see someone on FaceTime.
Yeah. Also
Now
yeah.
there are not everyone, maybe some people are, are fairly lonely and maybe they don't have a lot of connections. But they can always help others, and that's always been my advice for those who feel like, well, I don't have anyone. Like, well, there's other people who don't have anyone, and maybe you could reach out to them and help them. And so, but absolutely, of course, it's amazing. The brain is an amazing thing, right? We can, and it can lead us to be incredibly happy or incredibly unhappy, right? You could be in the same situation, right? Two people in the same situation could be very differently happy. And why is that, right? Because we're thinking and behaving and visualizing different things.
Right. Well, you have this famous pie chart on the how of happiness. Maybe you could just kind of describe it to people a little bit. And then obviously, it's a generalization about the
Yes. I don't like to talk about the numbers. Yeah. So the numbers have been misinterpreted. But yeah, just basically the idea is when you think about what are the determinants of happiness, one determinant of happiness is our genetics. And we all know some people are just born happier than others, are naturally happier. It doesn't mean that if kind of you're born less, if your set point for happiness is a little bit lower, it doesn't mean that you can't be higher. It just means you have to work harder at it.
Yeah.
Some people are just luckier. So genetics are part of it, big part, but it's not everything. And then another big piece are your life circumstances, right? Some of us are just more comfortable, richer, have a great marriage,
access to health care.
Exactly.
Not routinely attacked by police.
Exactly. So some of us are just luckier. And so those also matter, those life circumstances. Now they matter. For some people, they matter more than for others. If you're in a really bad situation, right? If you live in a unsafe neighborhood and you're worried every time you go outside that you might get killed by, then that's really terrible. And that's going to make people very unhappy. For those people who are more comfortable, then their life circumstances don't affect them as much. But if you're in an abusive relationship, it's going to make you very, very unhappy. So life circumstances is another piece of the puzzle. But then the third piece, which is the part that I talk most about because it's the piece that we have most control over, right? We don't have as much control over our circumstances or our genetics. Are, like I call it sort of intentional activity, sort of what we can do on a daily basis by redirecting our attention, by sort of changing how we think and how we act, that can affect our happiness.
Yeah. Even that research, which you're summarizing of a lot of people, completely includes people dealing with the hardest things of all. And what has struck me about this territory is that it's easy to dismiss it as sort of like something for yuppies to do at yoga camp once a year. But in fact, the worse a person's life is structurally, the greater the challenges that they're dealing with, the more they're being mistreated by their environment, the more that the world is not helping them. Precisely. It's increasingly important for them to do what they can to mobilize their internal resources to cope and to grow as best they possibly can. In terms of using that part of the pie chart, yes, it's not either or. Do what we can for sure to make the world a better place. One of the primary determinants of mental health, particularly, is poverty. Obviously, as you well know, and it's a major burden for mental health. Okay, we do what we can, but meanwhile, whatever our circumstances are, we have this power. We can always claim ourselves inside our own minds, and I think that's what that imagery in your pie charts really underlines here.
Yeah, but I think what I want to, I guess, make clear. I mean, my graduate students actually and I had this big argument about this after George Floyd's death, because they said, look, the work we're doing is just not as relevant. It's not relevant anymore. What we really need to focus on is on the systemic racism, on the systemic problems. And I absolutely agree that we need to focus on these problems. But I also think, as you say, at the same time, we also need to help people cope with the realities of their lives. And research shows that if you have more positive emotion in your life, if you have less stress, you're going to be able to change the world. You're going to be able to change the world and more effectively than if you're depressed and demoralized, right, and anxious and physically ill. And so I think you and I certainly agree on that point. But my students were really fighting with me about this. They're like, no, it's not important. And in fact, they thought it was sort of it's like we're belittling the people. It's sort of saying like, oh, don't worry that these horrible problems exist. You just need to change your perspective about them. But I think you would agree that that's not what the research is implying.
Oh, and that's not what we're talking about. It can
exactly.
be surreal, though.
Yeah.
To have a conversation about gratitude, amidst, real situations. And I know, I think it's just to kind of bring it, it's a situation where, let's say you're grappling with some major loss or some injustice or something you're just morally appalled about on the sake of others. And you've just gotten a bad diagnosis, let's say, from your doctor or something. And then somebody says, well, look on the bright side, or every cloud has a silver lining. You want to whack them, back off. That's not the moment right now for that. And so for me, there's some real questions here about timing and nuance and respect for the impact on the experience of others who understandably have pretty strong reactions to this territory. So, which then goes to the practical question of how do we respect what's terrible? How do we face it? How do we bear it? How do we name it? While also recognizing what's occurring alongside it in all kinds of ways, and retain the kind of inner freedom to have a wider view that can see all of it.
The big picture.
No small thing.
Yeah, and just a couple of more points about gratitude. You absolutely are right. Sort of hit the nail on the head about the timing. Right, there's a timing for gratitude. I mean, when you're in the acute phase, the initial phase of some kind of adversity, that is not the time to I think to be grateful, but to really deal with what you're coping with. But the other point is about us telling someone else you should be grateful, and that person deciding themselves to be grateful, right? And I would never. I try to be very careful about that. Like, you'd never want. And in fact, I was upset. What was it? I was talking to my husband about something I was very upset about. It's COVID related, and he said, "Oh, but honey, just think, we have our kids. You should be grateful." And my response was like, don't tell me to be grateful. Like, I know I have my kids and I'm grateful for them, but that wasn't the moment. So like, you don't want to tell someone else to be grateful, but that person needs to sort of choose it for themselves. Yeah.
That's great. Well, that's interesting. I wonder if I could just sort of ask you at a personal level. There's a saying that sorrow tenderizes the heart. Right. Compassion opens the heart. I had a spiritual teacher a long time ago who talked about keeping the wound of the heart green. It's a funny way to put it, but it's sort of, and you think about compassion, it's nature, bittersweet, right? There's the empathy for the suffering, if compassion is real, if it has real traction, with also the supportiveness, the benevolence, the kindness, the wish they not suffer. So there's a bittersweet of it. So you've, like everybody, you've been through stuff at this time, including your feelings for the impact on others of this time. If I could put you on the spot here, I'm a therapist, how have you grown? What's one way you feel you've grown?
Grown. Oh, yes.
During this time, not that growth makes, how can I put it, diminishes the horror show in many quarters of the world, but just personally, how have you developed, you think?
During this time? Well, I think one is just realizing that I have strength maybe that I didn't know I had, and I think we all have, thinking like, oh my God, I couldn't cope with that. And I couldn't cope with like not leaving the house for weeks, and realizing like, actually I can, I could make do and I could make adjustments. Another way actually just happened very recently with the protests, and we have kind of an uprising right now on our campus. I'm at the University of California. We're one of the few universities that are still in session. Tomorrow is our last day, actually, or Saturday is our last day. And there's sort of an uprising, and I've become actually much more kind of aware and tolerant. I mean, there's certain issues. I mean, and it seems kind of a cliche, but like I know all about racism, and I've thought quite a bit, I think, in my life about people who are facing racism, but still there are things I didn't know about. Like still there's sort of, and sometimes there are subtle ways that we could kind of contribute to systemic racism, and that the students on my campus are really highlighting for all of us. And so, so I feel like, it's not like, oh, suddenly my eyes are open that I didn't see it before, but I feel like my eyes are open in ways that they haven't before. And so I feel like, I'm learning a lot and sort of becoming more aware. I'm becoming even more, I feel like I was tolerant before, but I'm becoming even more tolerant, I hope. So, yeah. What about you, Rick?
I was just reflecting on that.
Yeah.
It's only fair if I I grapple with it too. And I mean, there's a lot. So I think that genuinely, my capacity to feel sorrow at the terribly hard way that life lands on many, many people, the knees on the necks, all kinds of ways.
In many ways.
That is, I think, genuinely expanded, and I'm just, as I reflect on that, the perimeter of that expansion is painful. It's uncomfortable. And our son Forrest, who I do the podcast with, Being Well, he just wrote a piece that's really quite, I think, profound. And as a dad, I'm actually really almost teary about just how much I appreciate him for doing that. So it's really quite amazing. It's titled "We Should Be Uncomfortable." He's speaking as a white man, 30-year-old, and two others. The point is, I'm just reflecting on that. And I don't mean at all to frame what I'm saying as crediting myself or that it's done. If anything, the fact that my capacity to feel that sorrow needed to expand, is something to look at in myself.
Right.
I think that's a thing. There are other things.
Right.
But that's
right. And it has consequences, right? So feeling uncomfortable and feeling really quite depressed, like I did. I remember at the very beginning of all this, at the beginning of the pandemic, some people I felt like were kind of running around and they're almost like excited, like, oh my God, I don't have to go to work now. Oh, what's happening? And I was just so depressed for all the people who are going to lose their jobs but because it leads to two things. One, it leads to gratitude, right? Eventually
for what you do have.
Right. About what I have, like really deep, genuine gratitude, not just like, oh, I'm counting my blessings, but like really deep, heartfelt gratitude. Like, wow, when you really understand what other people are going through. And the second thing, of course, it leads to is compassion and kindness, right? Because you want to help. So it has two really, really positive consequences, that sense of discomfort.
Yeah, that's true. It's funny too. There's another little part of it that I think for myself has been kind of a return to, and our kids laugh. So I'm going to reveal something about myself publicly that I don't think I've ever done. So when I was a kid, I would some of my major internal reveries, fantasies when I was going to bed at like 12 years old were about like a post-apocalyptic fantasy. There's been a nuclear war. My parents are still alive. They're okay somewhere, but now I'm on my own. And then what do? I played it out. And then even, before going to bed, I would list in my orderly way, what did I want to have in my survival bunker? If I could just have it I really wanted. How many crossbows? How many bushels of corn seed? And, my wife laughs. She says what she was thinking about was something like, the boys she was going to hold hands with eventually, things like that. So we just kind of laugh. So our kids have said, Dad, in a funny kind of way, you've been preparing for this in a lot of ways. So I want to be clear here what I mean. It's not so much about the zombie warfare, post-apocalyptic dystopia. It's more what this time has turned me back to are a lot of experiences I've had in wilderness that were really serious, where you really had to pull it together. You had to see where you were,
Yeah.
Slow it
Yeah.
down. You'd act
Yeah.
carefully.
Yeah.
Stakes
Yeah.
were high. Suddenly the
Yeah.
stakes were real,
Yeah. Yeah.
including the
Hmm.
moral hazard,
Hmm.
the stakes of who could you give this to, who gives it
Hmm.
to someone, who gives it to someone who dies, for
Hmm.
example. And I think inside many of us, and certainly I've tuned it more into this myself lately, is a scruffy, enduring force inside us all. And tapping into that sense of I'm going to get through this, I'm going to get to the other side, I'm going to try to do as little as harm as I can along the way. I'm going to try to minimize the harms to me along the way,
Yeah.
but I'm going to get to the other side of this. And that kind of moxie. I'm thinking lately about moxie as one of the great spiritual factors, as well as psychological factors in general. It kind of includes grit, Angela Duckworth's work, and goes beyond it. So I would say that's one more lesson for myself. I don't know. How about you as we finish here? Anything else you want to say?
Yeah. No, that was beautiful. A beautiful way to to finish that conversation. Yeah, I love. By the way, I love the word moxie. Well, again, I want to bring it back to connection, because that's, to me, that is the secret of it all. Is sort of connecting to others, helping others, being part of something, feeling like we belong, and making sure other people. In fact, this is what's happening with our country now. That there are a lot of people who don't feel like they belong, and we want to make sure, and we want to create a world where they and our children and everyone feels like they belong and feel like they're connected to something and someone. So that's how I would like to finish it.
That's beautiful. So thank you, Dr. Sonja Lyubomirsky, professor of psychology at University of California, Riverside, author of both The How of Happiness and The Myths of Happiness, and a really good person. Thank you, Sonja.
Thank you. You too, Rick. Thank you. Pleasure.
And thanks everyone for participating. And we saw the chats coming in, the comments. Thank you for the range of views there and the links and so forth. So take good care. And I'll be doing this next week. Okay.
Great.
Bye-bye.